I'm Andrew the Phoenix for Gaming Down Under, and let me be the first to say,
Welcome to New Zealand.
By the 80s, New Zealand had an estimated population of about 3.1 million people. The following decade, that wouldn't change very much. By the 90s, we had about 3.4 million. With New Zealand being split into two main islands, the North and the South Island, a majority of those people lived in the North Island. As you can probably tell, we're a pretty small country. Currently, our population sits somewhere around the 4.5 million mark. We are growing, if slowly. I was born in late 1990. I fell smack between the middle of the Sega Nintendo generation and the Sony Nintendo generation. So let's take a look back what it was like for New Zealanders growing up gamers in the 90s. I was a hair's length away from being an 80s baby. Sadly, I can't claim any fame to that era. I was a 90s baby, and I feel a very strange mix of pride and nausea because of that. While the gaming industry made huge strides towards both the gaming industry and just technology in general within this time, it also gave birth to a lot of very strange ideas that ultimately led to gamers being seen as not the brightest of people. I was born right on the edge of Sonic the Hedgehog on the Mega Drive, or the Master System, whichever you prefer, and Sega's Blue Blur was set to be an icon of an era. And he was, for a time. I'm not going to pretend that I'm a mastermind of the Master System. Unintentional pun. I only have very strong memories of watching my older sister play Sonic the Hedgehog, which I was never really any good at, mostly because of my age, but also because the game was just too fast-paced and I really couldn't get a handle on it. While there are a handful of other games, such as Earthworm Jim, which I do remember playing, they're not the strongest memories for me, mostly because I was so young, as I said. They did lay the path for me for my gaming future, but they are exactly that, my past. One thing I'm going to touch on just quickly is that some of the time frames for the releases and the times I play these games that I talk about in this video, they're going to sound a little bit strange. That only alludes more to the fact of how New Zealand was as a gaming community. Some of these things legitimately didn't arrive in New Zealand or in parts of New Zealand for quite some time after they actually released, and that was solely just down to the stigma that surrounded video games at the time. We didn't own our own PlayStation right away. My father used to rent one from some people we knew that ran a video rental store, and Tomb Raider was the first game I ever played on the PlayStation. I can still remember the layout of my bedroom that day. I know where the TV was, where the bed was, even the colour of the curtains. I can even remember that it was about 5:30 on a Friday night, and I played Tomb Raider as long as I could negotiate my bedtime. We got our own console a couple of months later, and we rented a majority of the games we played because, as I mentioned, we knew the people that owned the video rental store, so we always had a pretty good idea of what the best games were to play thanks to them. But the first game that we actually owned on the console was Crash Bandicoot. And we basically ran the finish off that disc, we played it so much. The next game that we owned was Spyro the Dragon, and my sister asked for that game to kind of be her game for the console, even though we shared all the games. Shared. Some of my favourite games I can remember playing on the PlayStation were Twisted Metal, Siphon Filter, Disney's Hercules, Judge Dredd, and Metal Gear Solid. Driver was also a regular weekend favourite rental, even though I mostly just played that horrible opening tutorial level. Everything in my gaming life was centred around the PlayStation 1 for about 3 or 4 years, mixing in the Game Boy Color with Pokemon and Zelda every now and again. But the PlayStation came out as a more adult-oriented console. Games like Metal Gear Solid, Gran Turismo, The Legacy of Kain, and Grand Theft Auto were all aimed at a more mature audience, with darker, in-depth storylines requiring good hand-eye coordination and the ability to think of tactics ahead of time. And while perhaps not intentional, these games were seen as boring by a lot of younger audiences at the time. If you've seen my other videos, you already know how insecure our schools were with anything that could be considered a bad influence. From trading cards to play fighting, anything that could be seen as bad was quickly dealt with harsh punishments or bans. I wouldn't say New Zealand was particularly conservative, but looking back on it as an adult, it had, and to a degree still has, a very strange ethical air about it. And it's mostly due to the vast amount of religions and belief systems that we have in close proximity to each other. Being of basic European descent, my house was run in a Kiwi fashion. Dad goes to work, Mum looks after the house, kids go to school, and we try our best not to break anything. It was seen as the traditional Kiwi upbringing, sort of relaxed and laid back in nature. Hot summers, cold winters, hard workers and fun lovers. That's what it was seen as to be a Kiwi. Yet literally a couple of houses down from us we had Pacific Island and Maori families with their own belief systems and their own family dynamics. Then of course there were the traditional Catholic and Christian households in which they were raised in the very traditional ways of the church. I will say there was a good mix of what I will call Kiwi Christians, so very laid back, fun-loving people who were raised with the Christian belief systems. What the hell does this have to do with gaming, you might be asking yourself by this point? Well, what it has to do with gaming is injecting gaming culture into an already established everyday culture, and how households reacted to a new aspect of the world being injected into their lives. Well, New Zealand reacted interestingly. While the rest of the world was facing down these game developers, addressing their controversial content in their games, leading to the eventual creation of things like the ESRB rating systems, New Zealand did what it does best. It took a hands-on approach. So while there was already an established rating system in place to help parents identify which games would be appropriate for which age group, New Zealanders needed to have a more hands-on control of the situation. My family was always pretty open to new ideas. Well, at least my mum was. So there was never really any serious restrictions on what I was and wasn't allowed to play. Even Grand Theft Auto got its fair amount of control at the time. But other people in other communities and other families, they weren't so open to these ideas. I'm not going to go into any detail about people or about groups. I'm not here to rip people out, but there were definitely people who believed that video games were going to corrupt us and put a stain on our little piece of paradise. There was three camps: people who played video games, people who thought people who played video games were losers, and people who were banned from playing video games whatsoever. Whether it was a parental or a religious thing, I'm not really sure, but these kids were not allowed to play video games at all. Almost as quickly as the gamer became an identity, it became a target. A target for those people who didn't understand and didn't want to understand what video games really were or how they could fit into our lives. I've been called everything you can imagine, right from the usual slang terms like nerd or geek, right up to immoral. I even once got told by a very elderly lady that I was in direct violation of God's final plan for the rest of the world. My bad, sorry. Now I'm not really sure how I managed that by playing video games, but for whatever reason it was a serious concern for some people within my community at the time, especially with games like Grand Theft Auto, which openly mocks things like religion and law. As we got older, more and more gaming options opened up, and at a time when controversy was high, at least for gamers in my home country, Nintendo gave us a little something else to distract us from this awful, awful world we'd created by becoming video gamers. Now, I personally didn't own a Nintendo until late in 1998. I managed to get one from a second-hand store at a very, very cheap price. I used to rent one every other weekend or so from the same video game rental store where I got my PlayStation, and other than that, I had a friend that owned one that we used to play at his house, obviously, because it was his. And if I had it at my house, that means I would have stolen it, and I'm not a thief. So by this stage, we really didn't care what anybody thought. We loved video games and we weren't just going to stop playing them because someone's mum said we should. The internet wasn't big enough at this stage for there to be an online community about video gamers for us to have any outside knowledge other than what we talked about with our friends. The Nintendo 64 not only marked a huge shift in gaming for New Zealanders, but for the rest of the world, unknown to us at the time. With games like Super Mario 64 and Zelda the Ocarina of Time being a massive nostalgia trip now, they really were amazing games and they still are to some. For those of us who preferred to see and play as a hero instead of, say, reading about one, there was so many options available to us, and storytelling was becoming such a huge part of video gaming that they would inevitably create so many stories that would become legends in their own rights. Mario and Zelda led the charge, with Donkey Kong, Kirby, and even Conker following closely behind. I can relate so many of my childhood memories to most of these games, and even as good as they were and as fun as they were, there was still a lot of resistance. Being a sports-mad country built on the legends of seafaring adventurers and gold miners and truck drivers, the move into the technological age always was and still continues to be an uphill battle, and we always seem to be just behind the curve. It wasn't just some religious, anti-video game ideal. As a country, we innovate so much now and we lead the world in so many ways. The 90s was a strange mix of excitement and hesitation, and it wasn't until the internet was properly implemented in our homes that we learned how big video gaming really was to the world and what we'd missed out on. So, to sum up gaming in the 90s, the pixel generation taking its first big steps into this new shiny world of video gaming, we were a country proud of its ideals, proud of its heritage, and proud of the way we had promoted our way of life to the rest of the world. All of a sudden, you've taken a country with legends who climb mountains, sports people who compete at the highest of levels, and a history of gold mining that spanned 3 generations. Native culture leading back thousands of years with tales of men who captured the sun and great beasts that roamed the waters surrounding their homes. We all of a sudden had this thing that was pulling us inside, keeping us away from time with our families, taking us away from what they saw as part of our history and who they hoped we would become in the future. So does that make us wrong? Absolutely not. Everybody needs to find their own way at some point in their lives, and video games are a good example of something that can become a phenomenon almost overnight. But I can understand the hesitation to allow something like this into our homes. So yeah, the 90s were a weird and a crazy time for gamers, but we survived and will continue to grow and change with the times. So don't let anybody ever tell you you're a loser for being a video gamer. Just remember who you are and let them have their opinions. That's what the 90s taught me about being a gamer. So hopefully you guys got something out of this video. I am trying to pull in a couple of my friends to collaborate on some unscripted discussions about video gaming, which will go up on a separate channel at some stage. So that should be interesting, if nothing else. But I really hope you learned something about New Zealand history and a wee bit about our culture and how video games affected us when we were kids. I'd really like to start some more discussions, so if there's anything you want to know, ask in the comments and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Other than that, as always, thanks for watching. By this stage, we really didn't care what people thought. We loved video games, and we weren't just going to stop playing them because someone's mum said we should. Cats in the shop. Good job, Mischief.